Greetings, everyone. It's Joyce Davis here again, President of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, for another Great Decisions 2023. Look, we have really tackled some of the most difficult topics that you can imagine in the world, and we're here to tackle another one. But luckily, tonight I have a lot of help. And I have Dr. Shirley Warshaw here, who is actually going to be our moderator for the evening. And of course, we have Dr. Evan Ellis, and Dr. Shirley Warshaw will introduce him and give you his credentials later on. But for now, we're not going to waste any more time. We're going to welcome Dr. Warshaw, Dr. Ellis, but now we're going to ask Cam, our project manager, to start the video and let us engage and watch the Latin Politics in Latin America Great Decisions video. Cam, take it away.
Just a quick clarification, the video I have says global famine.
Oh, no, I'll share. No, that's not the right one. I'll share the one.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the one for next week. So I will share the right one with us now.
Okay,
Not a problem.
sorry.
Let me get it. No problem. Let me get it started.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions. We begin the second half of this 8-lecture masterclass by turning our attention to politics in Latin America, with a particular focus on democracy development and recent elections. There are three main considerations that we will take before considering U.S. foreign policies towards the region. We'll look at Latin America before the emergence of democracy. We'll consider Latin American political tides, and then finally we'll take a look at contemporary elections. Globally speaking, democracy has risen in a series of waves. The first wave happened shortly after World War I with a sharp uptick in the number of democracies. There was a second wave after the Second World War, and then finally a third wave occurred in the aftermath of the Cold War. The trend in waves of democracy looks something like this. A major event occurs. It could be something profoundly bad, like a world war, or something quite good, such as the peaceful end of the Cold War that leads to a rise in democracy, a democratic wave. Then there is a crest, followed by decline. As we look at the world democratically speaking, and categorizing countries by the degree of democracy, we do note a couple of troubling trends in our hemisphere. Mexico has been downgraded lately from a flawed democracy to a hybrid regime, and the United States has suffered 5 consecutive downgrades in its democratic status. Once a full democracy, according to The Economist, the United States is now a flawed democracy. Looking more specifically at Latin America and where it stands in these global waves of democracy, it was in the late 1980s and through the early part of the 21st century that most of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean transitioned from authoritarianism to a democracy. If we were to create a hierarchy of democracies south of the border, without doubt, Costa Rica and Uruguay are at the top, impressive in their democratic systems. At the bottom, we have countries like Cuba and Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, clearly non-democracies. And then most of the other countries in the region, including Mexico, are either flawed or hybrid democracies. We begin by looking at Latin America pre-democracy, and that, of course, is the era of colonization. The Europeans arrived, most notably the Iberians, Spain and Portugal, and came to dominate most of the region in search of cheap labor and also exportable resources. When the Napoleonic campaigns began in early 19th century Europe, the countries that dominated Latin America were gravely weakened. They prioritized the war in Europe over their colonial possessions in our hemisphere. and as a result of that, many of the countries of South America became independent nations in the 1820s. While becoming independent from Europe, the Latin American countries were not able to secure their independence from the other major power, the United States, which had clear aims and intentions towards the region. In 1823, the United States announced the Monroe Doctrine, stating that this region should be free and clear of European influence. By 1904, the Roosevelt Corollary regarded the region as one where the U.S. had the right to intervene militarily as necessary to preserve our interests. So what is it about American interventions? Nicaragua alone was invaded 9 times by the United States in the 1900s. Other countries also were targeted. One of our purposes was to attain great power status. A great power is a particularly large and impressive country that wins most of its military battles and defines its interests continentally, if not globally. It is also a power that is accepted into the Great Power Club by other members of that club. In order to gain entrance, the United States believed it needed to dominate the region of the Western Hemisphere. We break through in 1898 by defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War and attaining great power status. To establish regional dominance was certainly one of the principal aims of U.S. interventions in the region, to secure allies in governments across South America and the Caribbean, and finally to prevent European intrusions moving forward. When we look at Latin America today and ask them basic questions, where is the most influence coming from? Is it the United States? Is it China or some other? The United States is still the one most point to. We are the dominant influence in the region, but look at how quickly China has emerged. It's now number 2 in ranking and closing in on the United States. A few years ago, a great decision was China in Latin America, where we focused exclusively on Chinese investments, loans, and political inroads in Latin America and the Caribbean. We asked Latin American citizens, who do you trust more? And while the United States is still number 1 at 56, look at how close on a scale of 0 to 100 the members of Latin America look at China. They view it as being as trustworthy nearly as the United States. And finally, we ask countries in Latin America, what is your role model? How would you like your country to develop both politically and economically? Again, on a scale of 0 to 100, the United States barely breaks 30 in a single country in the region. That, of course, is our southern neighbor, Mexico. Most other countries have very little faith in the American political and economic model. The transition to democracy in Latin America is thoroughly impressive. If we go back to the late 1970s, there are only a handful of countries, marked here in blue, that we would label as democratic. By 2000, almost every country in the region was viewed as democratic, with Mexico in 2000 joining the club for the first time. The political tides of Latin America have changed over the decades. We've seen a red tide after World War II, followed by a black tide, a pink tide in the 1990s, and now today we see political decay, declining democratic status, and what is referred to as a gray tide, as reflected in national elections. We begin with the red tide. That, of course, represents communism, and the primary advocate of that early on was Fidel Castro of Cuba. Castro led a peasant movement similar to what we saw in China in 1945 under Mao. He rejected the elites that ran the show in Havana, that invited the Western investors and property owners. He sought at the center of his political platform social justice for all Cubans. The red tide that began with Castro did spread to places like Nicaragua, and as it did, we viewed those nations as proxies of the Soviet Union, because the red tide occurred within the context of the Cold War struggle. As a result, we directed ranging military, political, economic, and intelligence pressure on those governments. We saw them as adversaries, and we sought regime change in those countries. The red tide, and America's response to it, resulted in the black tide of Latin America. The black tide of Latin America is associated with brutal and repressive authoritarian regimes, governments that were closely aligned to and supported by the United States, because we prioritized the struggle against communism over desires for democracy and social justice in the region. Having said that, the close alliance to the United States led to economic growth in most of those authoritarian regimes, which allowed them to stay in power for sustained periods of time. Third, we have the pink tide that occurred after the Cold War ended, where Latin America became democratized and immediately turned to the political left. Center-left and far-left candidates were successful in national elections. And because of that, we saw a more progressive and socialist agenda pursued. Many of the leaders of the pink tide, however, became rather rich and authoritarian over time. All power, Lord Acton reminds us, tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. We saw that happening in the liberal movements in Latin America. Nowhere was it more evident than in Evo Morales in Bolivia. He was a poor cocoa leaf farmer. He was a social engager and activist. He became the president of Bolivia in 2006 and remained there until 2019. And while he advocated for the poor and pursued policies that would promote universal education, land rights, and economic opportunity, he benefited greatly from his position in power. When he stepped down, he had a net worth of $185 million. The people of Latin America see through this. They hear the words that they want to hear, namely social justice and opportunity for all, but they also witness the rapid concentration of wealth in the hands of those at the top. The gray tide is the most recent wave in Latin America, and while it's not the most troubling, clearly the red tide and black tide were more devastating for the region, it does have ominous implications moving forward. Because the gray tide is synonymous with public disenchantment with politics. People are losing faith in the political order and in democracy. They are growing gravely tired of the violence that's happening on their city streets, and they want a firm hand in office that can calm affairs at home and promote the interest of a stable country moving forward. And this means they're moving away from democracy. What we're seeing happening in Latin America with the gray tide is the decline of democracy that is synonymous with other waves of democracy, globally speaking. The four tides of Latin America. The red tide is now gone. The pink tide led to the gray tide, which now seems to be reverting back to something akin to the black tide. Strong authoritarian leaders in place. So what's wrong with Latin America? What is hampering the region's democratic trend line? Low levels of public support in elected officials is first among all others. Then there are the anchors of history that just prevent Latin America from moving forward on the political spectrum. Those anchors include concentrations of power, militaries that are willing to jump in, overthrow democratically elected leaders as necessary, and low public participation in the political system. Income inequality is a major obstacle to democracy. When the vast majority of people don't own land, don't have economic wealth, they feel like the political order does not reflect their interest, therefore they don't want to participate. When they do, they have very little faith in the outcome. And then there is the crime and violence associated with Latin America these days, whether it is the drug lords of Mexico or the incredible violence in countries in Central America, not to mention the disaster that is Venezuela, there's a widespread concern over simple matters of safety. Therefore, many people in Latin America want a stronger government associated with a strong police force and a very capable military to maintain public order. Now we look at contemporary elections in the region. Since most all of Latin America has become democratic of late, there are a lot of elections happening each year. In 2020, we saw elections in these countries, 2021 in those, and in 2022, major elections happening in key countries like Brazil and Colombia. In the near future, 2023, more elections happening in Central and South America. In 2024 and 25, other elections will be happening. So there's a constant turnover of national government in Latin America. But what direction are these elections taking? In the period 20 to 2022, there have been many elections in Latin America. We can chart the results of those elections on a political or ideological spectrum ranging from socialism on the left to the hard right. 3 elections have resulted in centrist candidates, while a full 8 elections in Latin America over this short time period have resulted in leftist governments taking power. Chile, which turned left in its recent election, has made an abrupt U-turn, turning on its new guard. Gabriel Boric, as you see here, a left-winger, was elected in Chile at the age of 36, making him the youngest democratically elected leader in the world. He promised a new constitution, one that would anchor leftist principles, a constitution that was put up to national referendum and shot down by a near 2-to-1 majority of Chileans. They simply did not want the country to go that far left. Here we can see the outcome of many elections in Latin America between 2020 and 2022. The big election occurred more recently, and that, of course, is in Brazil. The face-off was between a current president on the left and a past president on the right, a scenario we may well see happen here in the United States in 2024. The incumbent sitting president is Jair Bolsonaro. He is from the hard right. Many refer to him as the Trump of Brazil, if not the Trump of Latin America. He was elected in 2018 and faced re-election challenge in 2022 by a candidate from the left whose name is Lula da Silva, otherwise known as Lula. Lula is left of center when he campaigns. He moves back to the right when he governs, and then goes back to the left when it's time for re-election. We know this because he was twice elected president of Brazil and reigned from 2003 until 2011. He has an impressive resume of leadership, of economic growth, of global popularity, and also an extended period in prison because he was convicted of corruption shortly after he left office. He was released from jail by a Supreme Court justice, and that allowed him to run in 2022. Before the election occurred, the candidate on the right was already undermining the democracy of Brazil, claiming before the election occurred that fraud was happening, that the only way that he could lose is if the other side cheated, by refusing to concede once the election was over, and even hinting at violence should he lose the national election. The winner of this important election was Lula on the political left. So we add one more election to our ideological spectrum. Brazil goes there. However, as noted earlier, since Lula very often governs from the center, it's pretty safe to put Brazil in this category. What is clear is that Brazil is not going anywhere anytime soon, because while Lula won the national election, the political right dominates the parliament of Brazil. It's very unlikely that Lula will be able to force through much legislation in this third term in office. We now turn our attention to U.S. foreign policy towards the region, and we do so by recognizing not all issues fall into the same category. There are those issues that we can do very little to change, namely the outcome of Latin American elections. But then there are issues where we can promote change. We can change our policy and improve our position in the region, and in so doing, our perception in Latin America may well improve. It is clear that we're in a battle for this region's heart, not only South and Central America, but the Caribbean as well. China has targeted our hemisphere. It provides enormous amounts of development loans, gifts to countries, and political support if they will either provide access to their resources, such as lithium or oil or natural gas, or if they don't have natural resources, many countries in the Caribbean qualify here, those countries will vote with China in international organizations such as the United Nations. We as a nation cannot take this hemisphere for granted. James Reston, the famous New York Times editor and writer, once noted, Americans will do anything for Latin America except read about it. We need to change that behavior. We should study Latin America, learn about Latin America, understand its interests, its priorities, and its concerns, and alter our foreign policy in ways that change their perception of us. We cannot simply assume that China's rising clout in the region will decline. We must be proactive and win the battle for the hearts and the minds of the Latin American populations. So let's focus now on areas of policy that we can change. One of them is Cuba. We have sanctioned Cuba for more than 60 years. Almost no one in the world agrees with us or even understands why we do so. Our two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, wholeheartedly reject our approach to Cuba. The main reason our sanctions failed there is that other countries aren't joining us. But it's deeper than that. The goal of the sanctions in Cuba is not simple policy change from Havana, but regime change. We wanted the Castros gone. Today they are, but the Communist Party of Cuba still reigns supreme, and so our sanctions continue unabated. U.S. policy towards Cuba hurts our relationship with all of Latin America and the Caribbean, and it pays virtually no dividends geostrategically, economically, or otherwise. Next is Brazil, a country that we had very close relationships with for the past 4 years. Now with the change to Lula, that may alter. Brazil is such a large and influential country. We should do everything in our power to remove many of the wrinkles in the fabric of the relationship. There's no logical reason for requiring Brazilians to have visas to enter the United States, and of course they counter that by requiring Americans to purchase costly visas to enter Brazil. It's such a minor issue, but it undermines the ability of both populations to travel to the other and engage in people-to-people exchanges. The plight of migrants is a very real sore spot. When they flow out of Venezuela, out of Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico into the United States, our policies are viewed as inhumane. We're pushing them back across the Mexican border and forcing them to wait out our processing, living in squalor and abject danger of being assaulted by gangs and violent individuals. And then finally, there is our drug policy towards the region. We must acknowledge that we're a very big part of the problem. It is our demand of drugs that results in the massive flow of cocaine, marijuana, fentanyl, and other illegal substances through Mexico into the United States. We cannot simply blame those producers in those countries or the governments that enable them, or look away as their policies allow for more drugs to flow to the United States. We need a more level-headed approach to our drug policy towards Latin America and the world in general. Shoring up these 4 areas would improve America's perception in Latin America and perhaps make us the role model that we really should be in this hemisphere. With that, I thank you again for joining me in this Great Decisions Master Class. In week number 6, our attention turns to global famine. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
I think that is a very good suggestion that we stay engaged and make great decisions. With that, I am now going to invite Dr. Shirley Warshaw and Dr. Evan Ellis. I'm putting their videos on now, starting your video. Dr. Warshaw, are you able to start your video? There you
we
go.
go.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Warshaw, who is a member
Okay.
of the World Affairs Council Board, an ambassador level member, and she's also an acclaimed scholar, presidential scholar, and much beloved in our community. So take it away, Dr. Warshaw.
Thank you so much, Joyce. We are very excited tonight to have a very accomplished scholar who is an expert on both Latin American politics and on China's intervention in Latin America. So Dr. Ellis, welcome. Let me say a couple of words about this incredible gentleman. First of all, he's sitting there in Panama City right now. So he's clearly been expert doing his work. He is a professor at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, right here in Carlisle. He is a research professor of Latin American studies with a focus on not only Latin American elections, but on China's intervention. And as we just saw from our Great Decisions video, we want to know more about China's intervention in Latin America. And Dr. Ellis, we really can't wait to hear you talk. He has published more than 350 works, including 5 books. And when I was looking up and reading his books, his latest one is called China Engaged. Did I say that right?
Engagement in Latin America, yes.
China's engagement in Latin America, distorting development and democracy, just published. And he's also published more recently, China in Latin America, the what's and wherefores in 2013. And when I was reading the reviews of this book, Dr. Ellis, people are off the wall about how amazing it is. So we cannot wait to hear your comments about the elections going on, the pink tide, the gray tide, and more importantly, China's intervention in Latin America. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll come back at the end to take questions. Dr. Ellis.
Dr. Warshaw, thank you very much, and my thanks to also Joyce Davis and the council for the opportunity to share my views with you. I would mention that in my capacity working for the U.S. Army War College, everything that I'm going to say this evening is strictly my own personal views as an academic. Having said so, I want to begin just with a series of comments about how I see the relatively complex state of democracy and political dynamics in Latin America. I'm going to hold off on some of the comments on China for the question and answer, but just wanted to say a few things in this very complex topic. First of all, I think for a number of reasons that have to do with persistent inequality in the region, persistent difficulties with development, corruption, insecurity, etc., there has been an erosion in the faith of the people in the region with democracy is what we would think of democracy in the United States. And that has led to increasing not only alternation between the right and left, between different solutions, sometimes more personalistic than others, but also a willingness to allow leaders whom people believe in as persons to allow them to bend the rules and not be quite as willing to defend what we would call procedural democracy. Along those lines, you also see increasingly and consistent with Latin American traditions, a strong element of what we would think in the United States as identity politics in Latin America. So when you take a look at the charisma and the connection, for example, that Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico makes with the people, AMLO. When you take a look at Lula, who again, despite having been, jailed and convicted for, corruption, and let out on a technicality in Brazil, the people of Brazil who connected with him were willing to, bring him back into office. Or, for example, the recently outed Pedro Castillo in Peru, who basically tried to dissolve the Congress and with something that was legally seen as a coup, but because he represented the excluded, often less lighter skinned people of the mountainous and interior of Peru, it was less important, the question of what he had legally done than the people that he represented. And so you have a notion of identity politics over procedural democracy that creates some difficulties. But even when we take a look at the trajectory that Latin America has followed today, you see that prior to COVID, there were those signs of strain. In October 2019, for example, in Ecuador, there were some very serious riots, in Chile as well, over a relatively small change in subsidies for the metro. So even before COVID, you saw those difficulties, but COVID took a lot of these social strains and really exaggerated them. So in addition to taking people who had just barely gotten out of the poverty and really pushing them back into the informal sector, pushing them back into basically marginalized positions, but it also caused governments in the region, especially the more wealthy governments, to do what we did in the United States, which was spend money like crazy and worry later where the debt would come from. But because Latin America doesn't have the same liberties that we have in the United States to borrow as much as we want on international markets, you have a lot of governments in the region facing some very difficult decisions, some very strained fiscal balances, now having to do difficult things with debt and raising taxes, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to that, you have changed patterns in criminality, both public insecurity by people who are economically more vulnerable than they were, but also different patterns of organized crime in the regions. So this has really created and really exaggerated a lot of the problems that were already there. And if that were not enough, you also had, thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, dramatic inflationary pressures. We've seen them in the United States, but in Latin America, in terms of the increase in food prices, the increase in petroleum and in other oil prices, such as cooking oil, such as heating oil, some of the most vulnerable across the region have been most greatly hurt. And so, for example, in places like Panama, where I'm doing work right now this week, or in Ecuador, or in various other places in Peru, you saw a lot of protests, people reacting to some of those things. Now, when we talk about the current situation across the region, I think it's oftentimes important to understand really what's going on. And first, I would emphasize not only in the diversity of the level of quality of democracy. You have some with relatively strong institutions like Chile, others where the perceptions of the quality of institutions are much less, but also there's a diversity in the types of left-oriented regimes. Although, really right now, there are very few regimes that we would not consider left in the region. Really, the few that would be remaining, we might say Panama, Costa Rica, Paraguay, and of course, Uruguay with the Caijepo regime. But in general, it's important to say that although you have a range of different leftists from what we would consider the more populist authoritarian left, like the Ortegas in Nicaragua or Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, ranging all the way to the more kind of principled left, such as Gabriel Boric, the young new Chilean leader. But in general, one of the areas that creates a lot of difficulty, given the socioeconomic context that I've just mentioned, is the fact that virtually all of the new left is embarked on what I would call statist solutions to some of the difficulties. In other words, trying to increase the role of the state in addressing healthcare systems, and addressing pension systems, in addressing some of the problems of poverty and other things, as well as turning to environmental conservation and trying to replace some of the drivers of some of their economies, such as, for example, the petroleum and mining sector in Colombia, with more green economies, which in principle is good, but given the reliance of these economies on these sectors, especially at this very delicate times, these are creating also some very difficult issues. And so one of the difficulties of this move in the region, it's not so much left or right as the risk of leaders who have very narrow coalitions under conditions of social strain, of radicalization and further problems. So we see this again where the Castillo government was put in a difficult situation, and now you've had significant protest against the vice president who took over, Dino Boluarte. You have concerns in places like Colombia, where the new left leader, the former guerrilla Gustavo Petro, again, is facing a lot of pushback in polarized societies. Even in traditionally very, very tolerant, multi-ethnic Brazil, again, there's a polarization due to the legacy of Jair Bolsonaro, with Lula coming back, that feels an awful lot like what we see in the United States with the legacy of the struggle between former President Trump and Joe Biden, but in a sense on steroids in Brazil, if you will. But it's also not just the left, because if you look at certain populist leaders in places like El Salvador, where Nayib Bukele has taken, has been very, very popular with some very radical actions, some would say anti-democratic, violating the rights of Salvadorians, but basically putting anybody with a gang tattoo in jail. Over 60,000 people in that nation of only about 2 million basically put in jail. But the streets have gotten safer, and it's made Bukele tremendously popular. You have some regimes that are flirting with the left, but are facing unstable coalitions, such as the Libre coalition in Honduras with Xiomara Castro. You have some, as I mentioned, in Colombia, where there are significant problems of trying to pursue a peace agreement with at least 5 major organizations in a context where narco trafficking and other violence is exploding. You have certain areas where the traditional populist left, which was more internationally isolated previously, Venezuela and Nicaragua, are increasingly becoming reaccepted in the region, with opportunities to essentially reintegrate also into some of the bodies, such as the Sao Paulo Forum, where their role has traditionally been problematic. You have some of the few remaining center-right regimes, such as, for example, the regime of Guillermo Lasso in Ecuador, facing those social problems, which have actually pushed them to the brink of being ousted from power. Indeed, Lasso is facing impeachment literally these weeks right now as we speak. I mentioned the difficulty of nationwide protest of Dino Boluarte trying to survive as a transitional figure to the elections in the future. In Bolivia, where former indigenous Cocalero ruler Evo Morales was briefly shut out by a transitional government, Janine Áñez, but now the return of the leftist MAS party has sparked what could almost be stricken as a civil war-like situation, a struggle for resources between the wealthier lowland countries and the leftist elite in La Paz. In addition to that, I mentioned the polarization of Brazil. Another center-right government, which has been relatively stable, although with its problem, Paraguay, is facing elections in which the wing of the Colorado Party, which is likely to come back, is strongly implicated with drug trafficking and other things, the Horacio Cartes wing, which, although the person who's likely to win the president, Santiago Peña, is not directly implicated, there are some concerns with where that could take Paraguay. And even when we look to Argentina, which has been center-left, some very serious problems with debt. So again, the nature of the problems across the region are diverse. We can see some of the common elements of the social mobilization, economic problems, et cetera. But we are really in a precarious situation in terms of the potential for difficulty. And of course, remembering that this is the region of the world in which we, the United States, are more connected here to what happens by ties of investment, by ties of geography, by ties of migration. When we try to ignore the region becomes a domestic problem influencing U.S. elections through migration, through drugs, which, drug overdoses last year, drugs coming through the region killed over 100,000 people. And so looking at the precarious position of the region, important to recognize that what happens in the region affects us and our lives as matters of internal politics and security in the United States. So with that, welcome the opportunity and the time remaining to take your question and respond. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Dr. Warshaw, you're on mute.
I apologize. Thank you very much for that. You went very astutely over many of the regimes in South America. There seems, however, to be a little bit of a debate. When we saw the Great Decisions video, we saw this black dot moving right. And yet there's a whole body of scholars that assume that we're moving towards more of a second pink tide. Which would you suggest?
Well, it's a great question. And anytime that one tries to make broad generalizations, you get yourself into trouble. So I would probably respectfully disagree with some of the characterizations, but I think in general, you can say that the political tendency is overwhelmingly toward the left right now. literally, if you look, and of course, left in Latin America is different than we understand left versus right in the United States. But if you look across the region, really the only nation that seems in a stable position to be in a right of center government, Costa Rica with Rodrigo Chavez, which is relatively stable. The Uruguay government, but even the Uruguay government of Lacalle Pou is very, it's what we call a rightist government in the European tradition. But again, where Paraguay is going, although that is right, it's in a worrisome direction. El Salvador, we would consider that populist, but not exactly left, but not exactly what we would consider a middle of the road democracy. And so to the extent that with just a handful of exceptions, the vast majority of governments are in one way or another, pursuing more government-oriented statist solutions, some more democratic like Boric, some more, again, authoritarian, dictatorial like Chavez, some more corrupt than others. But if we say left, right in a political sense, we are overwhelmingly returning to a left-oriented region.
Or a second pink tide.
The notion of pink suggests that it was red. It was red, but less red. What I would say is what was called the first pink tide. There are really kind of two general tendencies. One was an anti-democratic, more kind of corrupt populist turn to statist solutions. That was Hugo Chavez, and at the time it was Rafael Correa in Ecuador, it was Evo Morales in Bolivia, and to a certain degree the Ortegas in Nicaragua, and of course the continuation of Castro, and now of course Diaz-Canel in Cuba. But then there was a more democratic oriented, and this is the thing that the Castaneda's piece talks about, Lula the first time around, which looks a lot different than the second time around. Or you could talk about the Concertación in Chile. We could talk about Frente Amplio in Uruguay, then to the left. But one would generally say that it was more of a kind of a European democratic left. This time around, I would say that it's a little bit more fragmented. You have a hardening of a kind of a populist authoritarian left. You have a kind of a chaotic left in the middle, and you have a handful of I would say democratic principled left, and I would say Chile falls in that category. But I would say it's a different left, but I would say calling it pink understates the difference in character of this new wave than what we saw previously. But it's an important distinction.
Another question: can you give us any thoughts on Venezuela? Moderno, guide it.
Absolutely. So to me, the most important thing about Venezuela, is so many other places, is that when people in Latin America lose faith in democracy, they're willing to follow personalistic leaders who are willing to bend the rules. Now, long ago, beginning with Hugo Chavez, really, to me, Venezuela became a narco state. Venezuela is now a drug producer as well as a transit country. It's a host for any number of different organizations, in terms of illegal mining as well as drugs and other things. The regime is highly complicit. The Bolivarian National Guard has been so complicit for so long that there is a fear of returning to democracy because the people in power worry about what happens. Organized groups such as the ELN, such as the dissidents of the FARC, who is operating in Venezuela for so long, also fear any return to democracy. So frankly, with a control over the guns, and frankly also long ago, Hugo Chavez had brought in Cuban intelligence and an intense penetration of the Venezuelan armed forces, etc. So if you have the complicity of corruption with groups with a stake, there really was never a real possibility of the democratic forces being allowed a fair chance to vote back in. Now, what's happened is that little by little, those Democrats have divided because they couldn't achieve real change. Under the Trump administration, of course, we supported the constitutional claim of Juan Guaido. His own organization, I think because of frustration, the splintering of what remained of the Democratic left, basically has voted him out and replaced him with a group of unknowns in exile. And so really what we've seen now is the consolidation of dictatorship to the left. Now, there are strong, I think, disagreement among many in Washington about whether in the interest of getting a little bit of oil, it made sense.
Disagreement in Washington?
Never happens in Washington. Again, there are principal people that the initiative by National Security Council, Latin America Director Juan Gonzalez, and others such as Ambassador Ginny Story, the initiative to try to work with Maduro to try to get Maduro to democracy, whether that was actually counterproductive and foolish and just really accelerated the reintegration. But that horse was also out of the barn, because with the return of the left, Petro in Colombia bringing Maduro back into the fold, in Argentina recognizing Maduro, Lula recognizing Maduro, in many ways, the United States negotiating for a little bit of oil, which would go to Chevron and others, really kind of continued what really has been a reintegration of Maduro, which accompanied the consolidation of power. So to me, it's sad for the people of Venezuela, but I think what we're really seeing is really a consolidation, not unlike the consolidation of power that we saw with the Castros, which really has led to generations now of dictatorship in Cuba. And I think frankly, we're probably in for the same thing.
Oh, this is not good news.
Yeah, I wish I could be more positive, but there are theoretically talking about elections maybe in 2025, but even literally just today, Maduro has kind of thumbed his nose at anything that would be. Most of the opposition has already been outlawed, and so in the absence of a free press, and in the absence of free voting, in the absence of electoral observers being coming in, it's very unrealistic, much like Nicaragua, where you had the Ortegas, who again not only built upon the elimination of all of the other competing parties, and retook the presidency, and then just about a couple of weeks ago, essentially eliminated the last vestiges of local level opposition representation. So it's I think you have several countries where there's just democracy and free speech and possibility of opposition is just gone, unfortunately.
We have a number of questions, if I may pose them to you. The first is from Russell Goodman, who is actually a member of our board. And his question is, President Obama bucked the Cuban-American lobby to establish relations with Cuba. Obviously, President Trump rescinded that policy. How strong today is the policy against reinstating the Obama policy? President Biden has not done it.
No, and of course we can remember that Joe Biden was vice president under the Obama reopening in 2014, 2015. Although in many ways, I see Joe Biden himself is more conservative. And so there has been an attempt to ease up a little bit on the humanitarian restriction. But I think both there was a recognition that we gave up a lot with very little to gain under Obama. And so I think there's been a reluctance by the Biden administration to go back to the Obama opening. But there's certainly been an easing up on the real clampdown that we saw under President Trump, under Secretary of State Tillerson and Pompeo. So I think the focus right now has really been more on Venezuela and some of the other fires. But I don't see serious movement other than just a humanitarian opening on Cuba for the moment.
Oh, interesting. Another question from Christine Baer. What actions from the United States would you see as helpful? I think that has to do with dealing with the politics in Latin America.
No, absolutely. And there's a broad range of thinking on this of what makes sense. So I think in general, there is a need to have a balance between doing more to help the region in terms of development inequality. In general, some of the things that are deeply in need are strengthening the region's institutions. There are technical solutions and others in the fight against corruption. You can't restore faith in democracy without helping to fight corruption, and in the process of fighting corruption, also fighting insecurity, because those are the things that eliminate people's faith. Now, part of the fight against insecurity and corruption also is that we need to do more about the drug issue and other criminal issues. In part, that is solving the issues of our drug demand, but that's something that's a lot easier to say than do. But in general, without being able to control those flows of corrupting resources, you can't really restore faith in Latin American democracies. But at the end of the day, you also need, in terms of programs to help reintegrate people out of the informal sector into productive activities, especially in a framework of transparency and rule of law, and institutions that the people have faith in, so that they actually want to participate in those. And frankly, without judicial security, you're not going to get the companies that provide those type of opportunities. And so there's a lot of things you need to do kind of all at once in a coordinated way, because one thing or the other, it's not just a matter of giving more money. It's not just a matter of fighting corruption. It's not just a matter of drugs, but it's a matter of doing things in sequence all at once to help, at the end of the day, restore faith that democracy and limited government and free market is the way to go. But certainly more attention is needed, more resources is needed. And one of the other issues is you yourself brought up is there's a counteroffer, which is by China, which is
our next question.
Exactly. And so, okay, I'll wait for the next question.
The question is, go ahead, please talk about this. Please talk about the role of China in Latin America. Central America.
Absolutely. So to me, China is not trying to, there's no master plot to take over the world, but China is clearly pursuing its own economic interests. And along the way, it also is pursuing institutional interests, because it recognizes that it can't have anti-Chinese institutions and still be secure. And frankly, as China anticipates the possibility of a global fight, possibly with the United States over Taiwan and other issues, it recognizes that it needs to do other things in the security sphere. And certainly, as China has grown more confident and wealthier, you've seen an increasing aggressiveness, and you certainly see that with the personal style of Xi Jinping. And so we can go to issues like decoupling, et cetera. But
Dr. Ellis, could you focus more on the Belt and Road Initiative, because that's so important to what we're talking about here?
Sure, and absolutely. So
and I think you need to explain it.
Absolutely. So historically, part of China's own myth, we in the United States have our myth about, the United States, the shining city on the hill, what we believe about ourselves and how we relate to the rest of the world, which some of it's true, some of it's maybe not as true in the eyes of others. But for China, part of its foundational myth, if you will, is, in part its 3,000 to 5,000 year history. But going back to the Silk Road, also this idea that China is at the center of the universe, and there's this kind of mutually beneficial interchange of culture and trade and ideas with the rest of the world. And so as Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 and 2013, what was adopted is China's kind of public message based on its foundational myth for relating to the world was Belt and Road. The idea of, we want this mutually beneficial trade, and we're going to help build infrastructure, not just transportation infrastructure, but other types of infrastructure, communications infrastructure, digital infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, et cetera, and that there will be this mutually beneficial exchange. And the idea was also that, in 2018, that spread to Latin America, because traditionally Latin America wasn't even part of China's part of the world historically. But in 2017, when Panama recognized the PRC, and then 2018, Panama was the first state in the Western Hemisphere to be included in the Belt and Road. Then all of a sudden, everyone in the Western Hemisphere, even in the Caribbean, that had no historic relationship to trade with ancient Chinese empire, unless you go back to the Manila galleons with silver trade and things like that. But what it means to be part of the Belt and Road is not, there's no legal commitment, but it's a general idea of plugging oneself into the Chinese money machine, that somehow one is going to get prioritized for Chinese investment, and in turn, one is going to be open to doing trade with China. Now, the reality of Belt and Road has been a little bit less glamorous than others. There have been a lot of projects which were pretty politically and economically not well conceived. And so of the literally $1 trillion in Belt and Road projects in places like Central Asia and Southeast Asia and connections to Eastern and Southern Europe, something like a third, literally hundreds of billions of dollars in projects that either have failed or gone belly up, et cetera. Now, some of those have created difficulties with the money that China loaned, because the Chinese are very reluctant to just let people out of their loans. But China has moved away from Belt and Road. They haven't declared Belt and Road dead, but what they've done is they've let's go back to talking about basically South-South development. We're part of the developing world. And so the new name in town is something called the Global Development Initiative, or GDI, which is a little bit kind of more warm and fuzzy. But in general, what you see with Latin America, whether you call it Belt and Road or not, is that like other parts of the world, what China has sought to do is it's really sought to grab as many of the resources from Latin America and other parts of the world. So in Argentina and Brazil, it's like soybeans. In places like Chile, it's copper. In places like Ecuador, it's shrimp. And China tries to use its own companies and its own infrastructure to extract those things because it wants to get the benefit for itself.
So they build ports to get the ships in.
Exactly. So literally
they build roads.
Exactly. And oftentimes we focus just on the transportation infrastructure. So, for example, in Mexico, there's 6 Chinese operated ports. In Panama, of course, on both sides of the Panama Canal. Even in the Bahamas, Freeport, there is a major facility just 70 miles off the U.S. coast, operated by China. In Peru,
I did not know that.
Yes. There's a new port being built called Chancay on the Pacific coast of Peru, which will become the biggest port on the Pacific coast of South America, and that will also be operated by the Chinese. But it's not just the transport infrastructure. No, right. But it's also electricity infrastructure. Right. So, for example, Chinese companies, especially investing in solar power, in wind power, hydroelectric facilities. There are over 10 major hydroelectric facilities, even a nuclear facility the Chinese are building in Argentina. It will be the first nuclear facility in years in Latin America, but also electricity transmission. So these huge, electric connectivity across Brazil and in other places, but also digital connectivity. Right. So things like 5G, but also things like cell phones, things like fiber optics, but also fintech. So so just about all of the things that connect Latin America economically in terms of communications, electricity, transport. The Chinese are very strategically getting into those, as well as using those positions and connectivity to pursue the value added both in markets and access to goods. And so many people that used to write on, kind of neo-colonialization in Latin America, saying, okay, it used to be the Europeans and the US that were accused of, taking all of the good and getting the value added for themselves. In many ways, the Chinese have become that new displacing US investors and Canadian investors. And sometimes it's clumsy, but with the increasing Chinese footprint, there's been about $172 billion in Chinese investment over the past 2 decades, as well as in trade. The Chinese are literally now the #1 trade partner of every country in Latin America to the south of Costa Rica. And so that trade and investment gives the Chinese a lot of leverage. So there's the question of, well, Washington, you don't want the Chinese to be in, but what are you doing for us? And when are you going to come up with a better counteroffer? And there's a policy debate in Washington, an unease of the way in which the Chinese, because the Chinese don't come in saying, we want you to have democratic institutions. We want you to help human rights. The Chinese are just as willing to deal with a democratic regime like Chile as to dealing with an authoritarian regime like Venezuela, as long as they get what they want and as long as they get paid. And that willingness to do that is giving dictatorial regimes and others alternatives, saying, well, we don't have to put up with what the United States demands of us. We can be as corrupt as we want. We can be as non-democratic as we want. We can thumb our nose at Washington. And so at this very critical time in terms of a crisis of democracy, China, it's not that China is trying to be subversive and overthrow democracies like the Soviet Union did. It's that China, in pursuing its own self-interest and being willing to give money to people that work with it, is changing the trajectory and is undermining democracy, in many ways contributing to a region that is increasingly one whose character in terms of democracy and pro-US orientation is not what it once was. And that's making us uncomfortable. And frankly, given the importance of the U.S. being able to work in security and in other ways with those countries in the region, fueling a region which is moving away from the United States creates a real strategic and security problem for the United States.
Exactly, exactly. Dr. Ellis, it's a little after 6, and fortunately, we're going to have to end it here, because I think all of us could go on forever listening to you. You're so accomplished. You're so articulate. Thank you so much for being here and contributing to great decisions in Harrisburg.
The pleasure is
Yes, and
mine.
thank you both.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you both, Dr. Washer and Dr. Ellis. We have learned quite a lot. And, you know, keep up the great work. We are reading what you do. So you do have an audience out here, and you are very prolific. I get your stuff emailed all the time. So with that, again, thank you both, and thank our audience for being with us. Join us next week for another Great Decisions, this time on global famine. So thank you. Enjoy, everyone.